Okay, let's see. Right. Um, Another Molinar portrait that, again, I think, like many of his things, are sort of throws a monkey wrench, so to speak, into the works. Um, a portrait of his extended family as music makers, which would kind of make sense since he's working, as we'll see, quite a bit in the genre of musical companies. So that's Molinar standing on the right, and he is ostensibly the head of this family, although they are all siblings, either direct blood relations, and there were quite a few of them. Everybody well lit in the foreground is a direct blood relation, right? Brothers and sisters, all. And the shadowy figures in the back on the left are brothers-in-law, right? And the primary members of the family are busy, active as a musical group. Um, this is, I think, in many ways itself like Leicester's self-portrait, a portrait of status. He's the only one not making music here. He's a gentleman. He's an aristocrat. He's taken off one of his aristocratic gloves to greet us, right? And directly behind him is the family, but in portrait form. Numerous portraits of ancestors. And you get the sense that he is now the inheritor of this great family tradition, right? They're all there, but only in legacy, if you will. And that the mantle has now fallen to him to lead this family. And so, on a certain level, I think what he's appearing to us as is the concert master, right? Even though he's not carrying a baton. He's the one that's keeping the family together, and it's running harmoniously, and that's kind of the theme that he's working with here, is that it's running harmoniously. His sister, brothers, and two sisters, all playing musical instruments together, singing, not as cheery as a Judith Leister might be. I always found him a little bit more dour. But it is enlivened to a certain degree by the kids in the corner. That's his youngest brother and sister. And the little girl looks very stodgy. But the little boy is blowing bubbles. He's got that little shell, right? A broken cup, if you will, on a stick. And what you would do is you'd take the pipe and you'd put it in the soapy water, right? And it would, on the arc of the cup would then grow up and blow a bubble, and you can see it's there with the reflection on it. And directly behind them is Justice, a statue of Justice, right, which adds to our overall meaning. Right? So even the youngest kids are sort of the benefactors of his magnanimity, of his good stewardship of the family name. At the same time, there is, I think, again, this little wrench in the works, which is the idea of the bubble. The bubble being blown is a time-worn metaphor for the frailty of life, the fragility of it all. You never know when a bubble's going to break, right? You never know when death will come like a thief in the night, you know? And the boy couldn't be less carefree. Couldn't be more carefree about this, looking up off out of camera as he plays with the frailty of life as a theme. Here's Molinar again as a musician in this particular work, and again, I think he's giving us things that make it interesting on a certain level. He's dutifully tuning his lute. I like the fact that he's doing it by ear. Right? He's a visual artist, but he shows us now himself to us as a musical artist, as someone who is not even looking at the tuning key. He's getting it by ear. He's got perfect pitch, if you will, in addition to a good eye. And in this case, the lute player, one might want to read it again leeringly, or potentially read it as, again, the master of diligence, due diligence, the one who can indeed tune a lute and keep it tuned. It's been suggested that that's the reading he wants us to take with it, given that on the table are other temptations, and he's not paying attention to them. I don't know if I really buy that. That's what the National Gallery says about their picture, but I'm not 100% sure I get into that too much. There's some crumbly breads on the tray. There's a violin back there for someone to join him with, a pipe, two kinds of pipes, a clay pipe for smoking with a dish of coals, and then a musical recorder as well, lying underneath the violin. The jug looks very much like the jug from the family portrait on the terrace, the wedding fidelity portrait, in that it looks like the kind of thing that you pour water into wine with to water it down. And immediately adjacent to it is an upended wine glass laying on its side. So these things all seem to suggest on a certain level some ways to nuance the meaning in this. Are these the pursuits of physical gratification that he's ignoring? Right? Or is it more complicated than that? Is he inviting us to join in? One of the things I noticed when I looked at this more closely is it looks like there's a broken string. But at the same time, all the strings are there. I'm very kind of fascinated by that S-shaped hair coming off the bottom.
So
Yes?
sometimes if a string is pulled very tightly, it will come off the bottom, and if he's just replaced it and not cut it yet,
Right.
then
Well, this is okay. So in other words, so with gut, right? And lutes were gut. They weren't steel strings, right? In fact, we're coming up on one with a steel stringed instrument. This is a gut stringed instrument. So I was trying to think that through because I've got a guitar floating around the house, and the way you do it is you put the string into a hole and you put a peg in and it holds it there. But these are tied, right? So that could just be you could still retie it after the string was broken, is what you're saying. That solves something for me, right? Because on the other end, I'm not sure that that's the other end of the string on the right, so much as it could be, but it could also be the cord from which you hang it up on the wall, right? And I found that in some of these other pictures that it's there. But the idea of sort of it seems like what he's probably doing is he's retuning after restringing, right? Which is, again, keeping things in harmony, right? That said, and by the way, you can see all sorts of pentimenti from where he's changed his mind with the hand and the paint's gone transparent over time. And you can even see it around his legs as well. The broken string on a lute usually means disharmony. Okay, now this is an odd picture to bring in. There's no way that Molinar probably knew this because I don't think he went to England. This was painted for the court of Henry VIII, and it illustrates two ambassadors who came to visit the court of Henry VIII to try to barter peace, just as Henry VIII was leaving the Catholic Church. So they came from France to try to work out peace. And on the wall, on the table around them, are various symbols that relate to sort of trying to bring peace back to the world. And we have a celestial globe and a terrestrial globe and various things for gauging distances and whatnot. But on the bottom shelf, there's a lute with a broken string. And it's right next to one of Martin Luther's songbooks. So it's the idea of disharmony in Europe is there, right? So I was just kind of curious about the Molinar thing. I think he gives us the possibility of reading it multiple ways, as disharmony as well as harmony, or the idea of diligence and keeping things in harmony by avoiding that disharmony, right? Now, I mentioned before that Jan Steen studied under one of Molinar's pupils, and I think that this picture is a parody. It's just too close in too many ways to Molinar's picture. to kind of be read any other way, where Stain puts himself much more disheveled, uh, playing the lute next to a table arranged in very much a similar fashion, with some of the same accoutrements on it. Um, to not have it be Stain's sort of mocking sense of humor about uh, his artistic grandfather, if you would, right? The master of his master. Another Molinar with Leicester, right? The first couple of group portraits that we saw were before they got married. They got married in 1636. And she does appear in his portraits or his pictures after their marriage. And in this case, we see him in a very similar pose to the self-portrait, and this is another self-portrait on the right, playing the lute again. And she's playing a cittern, which is a steel-stringed instrument, and gives, from what I've read, a much more sort of sharp sound to it. Again, a table off to their right with still life elements on it that bring up the traditional way of reading still lifes, which is this idea of partaking but not too much, right? And that still life off the right could easily be mistaken for Willem Heda or Peter Klaas, who were active in Haarlem at exactly this time, and he includes it there as sort of an homage to his compatriots. On the wall, a map of Italy, of all things. I'd like to sort of know a little bit more about this. This also recently sold. It was in a private collection, and I don't know where it is now. Still in a private collection, I think. The lute is, again, the same thing, right? It's got the broken string in it again. Both up above, and this one doesn't look like the string for a rope over Judith Leister's head. But we have that same string coming down off the base of it as well, to suggest, again, the same sets of themes that we had with the self-portrait, right? So again, it's I think in many ways it's an image of marital harmony, right? The two of them working together to bring harmony to the group. Our last Molinar from the trip in the Rijksmuseum is again Judith Leister as the musician, and in this case, again he's taking sort of traditional themes and he's mixing them up in a really kind of fascinating way. That's him coming through the door. That's definitely him. Same hat that we have in the other pictures that he wears, and now he's intruding. He's stepping up into her room and coming into this. And what happened, of course, is he's opened the door, is his stupid little brother and little sisters have come in, and they're bugging her, right? She's working, making music, and they're interrupting, and the kid's got the same sort of jubilant face that he did in the self-portrait with family members, only now he's looking at Aunt Judith and the girl much more serious. Part of me wants to read this from her perspective again. You know, this is exactly what Molinar did to her production. It's like she had to stop playing things, as it were, stop making art in order to be a member of this family, and it's a choice that she made. The virginal that she's playing is decorated on the lid with lovers walking in a landscape. And so is the one that was in the self-portrait with family members. You can see just behind her shoulder a pair of lovers beneath a tree there, encountering each other in the landscape. This is not uncommon for musical instruments to be decorated with images of love in the garden, love in the landscape underneath it. I think on a certain level, Molinar is sort of inventing around this idea. But in this case, again, he mixes it up. He gives us that monkey again, the chained monkey that we saw in the marital fidelity allegory, as an idea of keeping carnal desire in check, right? And we add to that another element, which is above the doorway. There's a bird cage hanging here, and it's empty. And here again is Molinar playing with conventions. This is from an emblem book. Birds in a cage, a bird, or sometimes pairs of birds in cages, were seen as a metaphor for perfect love. it is better to be caged by our promises to our beloved than to be free. That where freedom brings danger, in this one, obviously, you have that bird of prey up above, right? That there's the safety of partnership. And with an image that has both Molinar and his wife in it, with music and lovers and the chained monkey and everything, this adds a dimension. But the fact that it's empty, if indeed it is, you can see the picture's kind of abraded. It's not in the best of shape in this particular area. It's been scrubbed a bit. But if indeed that cage is empty, then what does it mean when the bird's flown the coop? If a bird in a cage is the safety of marital fidelity, then a bird out of the cage has to be the lack of safety of marital infidelity, right? And it's almost as if Molinar is sort of mixing it up for us and not making it easy to interpret it only one way. And the overall picture itself is a standard tradition in genre scenes of a man coming in, a lover coming in to make music with his beloved. This wonderful Terborch from the National Gallery shows exactly that. The lover coming in from the left, perhaps to make music, perhaps to make love, right? And again, there's sort of signs both ways. The man warming his hands by the fire could be the one that was playing the cello with the lute player at the table. Or the gent in black could be the man that's come in to play the cello with the lute player. Or he could be coming in to meet with the woman in red who's put down the cello to talk to him, right? All of these are possibilities. And that idea of sort of barging into a music-making room to join in the music is, in fact, exactly the theme Molinar gives us, only he views it from an alternative point of view, as we're 90 degrees off to the side. Okay. So Molinar presents a kind of an interesting figure in this musical groupings, as it were. Not only as, I like to discuss him only as Judith Leister's husband, because so many women get discussed as so-and-so's wife, right? That it's high time to turn that table a bit. And for my money, I'm not anywhere near as enthralled with Molinar as I am with Leister. I think she's a significantly better painter than he is, significantly. But he's not that he's bad or anything like that, right? And he's kind of important because he's a very, very good teacher, right? And there's good students that come out of his Harlem studio. He's kind of boring. They're kind of redundant. I like that lute player.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know that he's got interesting elements to everything, and you can interpret it in a number of ways, but, like, Judith Leister's pictures are fun to look at, and because they're just kind of like, I would walk by this one, not this one, but I would walk by a lot of the other ones, but I would not walk by one of hers.
That's right. No, she's fetching. She's engaging, right? She got that from Frans Hals. And even though he's the one who studied under him, that we know for sure, right? That he's the one who studied under Frans Hals. There's an interesting thing about what did you learn from Hals and what do you do when you leave the studio, right? And that's a question we often ask with when we find out somebody's a pupil of another artist. The question is then, what does it mean? And we've seen with Rembrandt, for example, studying under Peter Lasman, it meant the world, right? It really defined his career. And he borrows things from it. Even his paint application is kind of Lasman-y early on, but certainly the way he arranges themes, thematic choices he makes, compositional arrangements, modes of emphasis, these are all related very, very closely to his tenure under Lasman. Then you get all of Rembrandt's pupils, right? Gerard Dow, right, who becomes a fine painter, right? Carl Fabricius, the beautiful goldfinch picture, right? These are Rembrandt pupils. And while they're in Rembrandt's shop, they look like Rembrandt. But as soon as they leave, they do something entirely drastically different, right? some of those history pictures that were in the Royal Palace are Rembrandt pupils, and they don't look at all like Rembrandts. Leicester looks like Halls. And what Megan is saying is exactly right. She not only does she look like Halls, but she actually channels that infectious nature, that infectious participatory nature that her husband doesn't get, for my money. Right? I mean, I think he's interesting, but yeah, they're negligible in the grand scheme of things. I always think about, like, what would happen if someone said you had to teach Dutch art with 5 artists or 10 artists or whatever, right? Who would they be? Molinar doesn't make either of those cuts. He doesn't, maybe he doesn't even make 20, you know? But Leicester makes 10, I think. She gets up there, right? Yeah, you know, why show this when I can show a Jan Steen with the same layout as the picture on the left of a woman playing a harpsichord with somebody coming through the door? Why show this one when I can show that one instead, right? So yeah, they don't engage. They don't. There's nothing out that even Ter Borch, right? That satin just grabs you, you know, and you enter into the picture because of that. But yeah, monkeys maybe, but that's not enough. And certainly any picture with a monkey trying to get it on with a cat, it may be worth looking at in its own right, no matter what. Molinar did have pupils, right? So he studied under Frans Hals, but he taught Adriaan van Ostade, who was Jan Steen's teacher, right? And so this Hals' studio is producing artists coming from sort of very different directions and moving in very different directions after leaving his studio. At the same time, there is a connection between Molinar's Merry Companies, musical images, and Frans Hals' work. And there is a connection between Adriaan van Ostade's peasant imagery and Hals' work, right? They both have roots there. And for these peasant images that Van Ostade was most famous for, the other person who enters into the mix is a Flemish painter named Adrian Brouwer, who actually also came to Haarlem in the 1620s and also worked in the circle of Frans Hals. Now, this whole theme of rural peasant tavern scenes is relatively new to Haarlem in the 1620s, but is old hat in Antwerp, generations old. And Brouwer is one of the figures who helps to bring it north, right? Helps to bring it to Haarlem, because he ends up there for about a decade in the 1620s. So here in the Moritz House on loan from the Rijksmuseum is one of these peasant rural genre scenes, which in the 1620s are very boisterous. The peasants are uncivilized, which is kind of how people viewed them in the 1620s, right? They're laughing, they're drinking, they're puking, they're spitting, right? They're uproarious, right? They're gregarious, right? They're active and overindulgent, and they're seen on a certain level as being the antithesis to the cultured people of the city, right? They're the uncultured country bumpkins. And Brouwer brings this north where the tradition can best be seen again through Bruegel. Bruegel, there's a lot of Bruegel going on still in the 17th century, even though he's a Flemish painter and artist. When we look at 17th century Dutch art, the legacy of Bruegel is so strong. And so this is a number of images of peasant festivities, people visiting them from the city. In this picture, the Feast of St. George is when the crossbowmen who are dedicated to St. George have their annual shooting fest, and there's a bunch of other partying goes on around it. Back left corner, you see them shooting at the shuttlecock, right? uh, all the way on the horizon. On the right, there's a tavern where they have their banner hung from. And it's just nothing but party, right? And there's a couple of pair of men in the foreground pointing inward and looking out at us. And they're the city visitors to this country fair, right? I talked to my undergrads about this a little bit, about like, do you guys go to state fairs and county fairs? I love going to the county fair, right? I haven't done it since I've been out here, but back in Oregon, we went every single year, like Tillamook County Fair, right? Because we had a cabin near Tillamook, and I was from Portland, and so going to the country fair was like, cool, pigs, right? And all sorts of fun stuff that was going on. There'd be these weird competitions, and then, everybody's got their quilts and their jam and their hams and whatnot, and their farm animals. It was really fun to go. And they had an art contest, and since I went to school in Portland, we would clean up because I had an address in Tillamook because we had this cabin, right? But art teachers in Tillamook weren't as good as the art teachers in Portland, and I was like doing media that they'd never heard of before. It's like, just go and clean up, right? Walk home with 10 gold blue ribbons from the fair. Anyway, we just loved going, and to this day, people love going to county fairs from the city because an introduction to a kind of life that you don't enjoy or experience, right? So here, the Feast of St. The more you look, the more fun it is. There's a couple kids playing hobby horse, other ones just wrestling around. In the background, just in front of the church, you can see a fake dragon. You see that? And a guy on a horseback. They're sort of St. George. They're enacting St. George jousting with the dragon. In the back on the right, there's a little mock stage. They're making a little play there as well. But it's sort of dominated by all this festivity and drinking and music making and songs and dancing, carousing and so forth. That is exactly what Van Ostad is depicting, right? So this tradition that we're seeing around the Hall Circle in the 1620s, Van Ostad, Brouwer, Hals himself, right, is definitely owes its legacy to the Flemish and Bruegel coming up through these Flemish immigrants, right? Now, later in his career, Van Ostad's pictures get a lot more tame, right? And we read an article about this a bit. But one of the things that didn't get really mentioned there is the fact that really by the 1650s, kind of after the war, after Holland achieves its independence and they're not fighting for their independence anymore, peasant life transformed in the minds of many people who lived in and around the cities. And it went from being uneducated, uncivilized others to being uneducated, uncivilized others in a good way. And a lot of people suggest that this is because of the vast amounts of new citizens in the cities and basically the crowding of the cities that led people to look at country life as being an unspoiled antidote to one's urban existence. It's not crowded, life is simple, and the peasants do things for their own personal gain, but to a certain degree, sort of just for sustenance. Whereas a lot of the new immigrants into Amsterdam, one of the big complaints is that it's so damn greedy. Right? That they're just here for the money. They've only come to Amsterdam to make a quick buck. And that peasants were living a simpler existence, one that was truer and more honest, closer to their roots. And the Dutch could actually trace, well, they actually did trace, I don't know if it's real or not. They felt that their legacy, their heritage, their forefathers, their ancient ancestors lived in the woods. The Batavians who had been colonized by the Romans, right? And so that idea of getting back to something that's rural and closer to the land was for them getting back to what does it mean to be truly Dutch? It would be to get back to this sort of rural non-urbanized existence. That's more, again, honest, direct from where we came from, right? Where they thought they came from. And especially when the cities are increasingly populated by people who aren't Dutch. All those Germans, right? All those Flemish that are coming in, right? So the cosmopolitan nature of the city made people then think of the countryside in a much more positive manner, right? Rather than being judgmental. There's still others, but they're a positive other rather than a negative other. And Van Ostad's images after the 1650s are significantly more positive than the early ones. We lose the carousing. People don't jump up on the tables, stomp around, drink too much, throw up, right? Pass out. We don't get that. We get these. I mean, card playing is never really a good thing in paintings, right? We've seen a lot of paintings with card playing where card playing is bad, right? But usually with those paintings, we get something else going on around the card table that says this is bad. There'll be a guy that's fallen off his chair, somebody leaning over to puke, while they're playing cards. But here, this is a piece, or like reaching for a knife behind their back, This is a very, very peaceful little card game. This is a civilized group of people. Nobody's obviously cheating, right? That's another thing we often see are obvious cheats. What's a good card game is not about the card game, right? Again, this is going back to my TMI about my past, maybe. But at this cabin in Tillamook, we would play cards for hours, and the whole point was we didn't care, right? The card game was the facilitator of sitting around for 4 hours with your friends. And nobody cared who won. We didn't even care about the game. We used to have to pass around a shell. We call it, you got the conch out of the Lord of the Flies, right? You have the conch. Because then you knew whose turn it was to play cards because we got distracted. We were just there to talk. And that's what this is all about. The cards are an excuse to sit around all evening and smoke with your friends. And of course, it's very sexist because they're all men, right? What are the women supposed to be doing while they're here? But that's not really, that's the 21st century reading of this, right? So it's a very peaceful kind of interior as opposed to the earlier things. And, what do we have happening around the card tables? We got a guy warming his feet by the fire. It's just as peaceful and harmonious as could possibly be. There's this Dutch word, you guys might have heard it, right? Gezellig. Gezellig means cozy, comfy, right? And it's more than just comfy. It's warm and convivial and inviting and friendly, right? It's not just soft and cushy, right? There's more, but it is soft and cushy. It's not just that, right? It's everything. These are gezellig interiors, right? They're just as warm and welcoming as they can be. And I think they're very positive depictions of rural life, right? And if we take that in mind when we look at these other images that he does later in his career, and they are also equally positive, equally sort of extolling the virtues of country living, right? And it's not country living as in, we had a cabin near Tillamook. Not like that. It's country living as this is where they live, right? So, it's not Piney Meeting Branch Road off of River Road or something like that. And in this case, this is the perfect rural family where everybody gets along. They're not rich. They can't fix the windows immediately, but they're not so badly broken that they need to be fixed, And it's warm out, right? So wait till the winter and fix those little broken panes in the window. The clothes are tattered, but they're clean, right? Really clean. I like that they sweep their dirt. They've got this courtyard, and there's a dustpan and a broom. This is a well-kept little house, right? Not wealthy, but diligent, right? They're well kept. And what Van Ostade gives us is a family where everybody gets along and it is perfectly in harmony. So we've got 4 kids, right? Range of ages here. And the middle 2 play with each other, right? So you can see the oldest daughter is back on the left in red. Now then the next oldest is the son. Next oldest after that is the little girl in blue and yellow. The youngest is back in the arms of his sister, right? Or her sister. And so everybody is sort of doing their part to keep the family unit running nicely. And here's little boy, one of his socks has fallen down. That's all well and good. And he's playing with his sister and the puppy, right? And you know me, dogs, right? It's my thing. And if we look at the rest of the family, then we see the sister taking care of the littlest one who needs the most attention, right? And you can even think of the little boy as keeping the dog away from the little kid who he might jump up on and knock over. But the little kid needs attention because mom's got work to do. She's shucking mussels, right? She's debearding them, right? Raw mussels grow with that filament that attaches them to the rock. That we call the beard. You have to cut it off because it's utterly inedible, right? In fact, some fishermen weave the mussel beard into gloves because they're knife proof. I mean, they're so tenacious, that material is, that you can actually weave gloves out of them and you won't cut your hands ever, right? Oyster shuckers used to have these, right? So she's debearding the mussels, right, and putting them on a tray for dinner. I like how they've got the carrots out of the reach of the chicken, up on the wall. But there's Dad, and he might look menacing at first, but what's Dad's role? He goes back and forth between home and the world. That's right where he is. He protects the family. He's the door, right? So these are just sort of these perfect idyllic country families that Adrian Van Ostade is giving us, right? So this becomes sort of his specialty. And like I said, these late paintings by him very much developed toward a much more idyllic kind of countryside. His little brother, significantly younger brother, was a painter as well. So Adrian studied under Hals in the 20s. Isaac studied under Adrian in the 30s and early 40s, right? So he apprenticed under his older brother. And like Adrian, he too specializes in images of sort of idyllic country life, right? At the same time, he's somewhat earlier. He dies in the 1640s. He dies by age 28. That's very, very young. And many of his images are a little bit leaning more toward the sort of country bumpkin outlook. Not entirely, but a little bit more in the transitional phase that way. And so what we have here is a rustic inn, a country inn, probably equal parts tavern and hotel. We know it's an inn because of the sign over the door. The innkeeper leaning out beneath that pot that's been hung from the door. It says good luck symbol, right? Here's a nice detail of it. Again, faithfulness, fidelity through the birdcage, right? That standard theme. How, again, one kind of picture can enlighten us to how to read other kinds of pictures is so important for us as we try to understand what we're looking at. Right? So there's our innkeeper, and what we're seeing is just a rustic image of everyday life. The morning deliveries, right? Beer being offloaded and brought to the inn for the day. 2 fellows with the yoke over their shoulders as they lift a full keg of beer off of the sledge to deliver it to the innkeeper, right? This is a happy and convivial place, signified by it being sort of nicely run, well managed. It was a bit of a old wives' tale that storks would only build their nests on happy homes, right? And so there we see a stork's nest up above that signifies this as a happy home. But I think that with Isaac van Ostade, there's also this question of the fact that these villages, while they were filled with rustic interiors that were paragons of virtue, and they were also places that, not necessarily virtuous people lived in either. They're fighting dogs in the foreground, right? A little boy behind them trying to hold his puppy back, right? Don't get involved in the scrappy little fight here, right? So not everything in this village is peaceful. And we've got, as we move our way deeper into the background, all sorts of sort of the riffraff of the village, right? John should recognize our fellow with his hat down, right? There's a cripple with an injured foot walking on a peg leg to keep his foot up off the ground. I always think this is likened to, you see anymore, they got it on a skateboard, right? Somebody's broken their foot and they'll have their knee down and then ride it on a little cart that looks like a skateboard. Somebody purchasing had that a year ago or so when she fell down and broke her foot. Here he's keeping all of the weight off of either a gouted foot or a rummy foot in both of these. And I think the figure on the right shows us that he's not trying to fool anybody with that because it's too danged obvious. It's not strapped up behind his back or anything. He's just trying to keep the weight off it by walking on the peg. But that's open to some possibilities. So we're seeing, right, the street people of the village in the same way that Rembrandt saw them around the town, around Amsterdam. Underneath the tent, a woman's making pancakes, right? And Rembrandt also did an image of this in Amsterdam, of pancake makers. And one wonders if Isaac van Ostade knows these prints and is incorporating them into his imagery, right? The little boy with the dog, for example, in Rembrandt's print, the dog's doing his darndest to get a pancake out of the little boy's hands, right? Deeper still in the background, we see more dogs, and we see a fellow on a dais with what looks like an artist's easel behind him. And what he is he's the Wizard of Oz in Kansas, right? He's a snake oil salesman, right? He's selling tonic. He's a quack, right? And he's, buy my stuff and you'll cure everything that's ever happened to you, yeah? And Rembrandt does them as well. Here's his quack selling his wares, more itinerant than the one who set it up here in the countryside. And Isaac's brother Adrian also did very similar images of this. This one's I think it's in the Moritz house as well. So Isaac gives us these sort of some of the downsides, if you will, of village life. Another picture by him at the National Gallery that I think picks up this idea of rural villages as antidotes to big city life, well worth the visit, and presenting to us hospitable places where we might stop for a beer. But then some of the problems that might come with that as we engage, as dazzling urbanites that we are, with rural folk, right? So we see on the right-hand side, in front of a church, there's always a church in the background too, another of these rustic inns. And it looks so much like, you can tell what he learned from his brother, right? There's a sign hanging outside, all this ivy growing on the walls. It looks very much like Adrian's courtyards. And it's a fairly convivial place. There's a group there smoking, although I think one of them is peeing against the wall, right? He's got his back to us. That's almost always a good sign. And there are two very well-dressed men from the city who have come and have hopped off their horses, right? And they're going to stop at the inn. So this fellow in yellow, as a couple comes up to him to chat with him. Again, look at the difference in social class based on dress, right? Torn and tattered versus this nifty yellow hat. The other fellow on the left about to get off of his, and again, one of or part of Van Ostad's message is, of course, that this interaction brings interactions you may not want, right? That by stepping off of his horse, he's almost immediately encountered by beggars, right? And that is a way that possibly we can read all of the figures that are coming up to them as wanting potentially a handout. And that we get within the picture, sort of think of as a fulcrum with the man in the black as the center. We have a group on the right that's sort of minding their own business, and then we have this other group on the left that is paying attention to them and are the people that are coming toward them. Even behind them, we see people turning to look, right? As new blood has arrived, right? Now, one last thing about these is that the idea of stopping in an inn, right? Working your way through the countryside and stopping for a drink or a room has a long tradition in art of the Low Countries. And usually when you were traveling and you stopped at an inn, you showed a lack of due diligence. You're not seeing your journey through to the end. And that walking through the countryside was seen as a sort of a metaphor for our lives, and that distractions, inns and whatnot, were likened to sin that might waylay you on your path toward righteousness, right? And that we should therefore avoid them. And if we look back at the legacy of Northern European art, particularly from the Low Countries, this is exactly how inns usually appeared, right? So The Wayfarer by Bosch, right? Bosch is right on the edge of the north of Holland, right? Only before the war broke out, the 80 Years' War. And this was the outside of a triptych opened up, right? And it got split up over time, and so now it's been sealed into one works. But those were two wings, and you can kind of see the seam, right? And on the opposite side of the left wing was a painting in the National Gallery of a miser at the end of his life. So this is meant to be life proceeding, and then we'd open up and see the end of life. And he's a pilgrim, right? Life's pilgrim, and he's on his path, pursuing it through a dangerous landscape. And we want to wander our way back, and we can see a snarling dog. We see a pigsty that makes us think of the prodigal son, although he's not the prodigal son. A gateway that he's about to go through with a cow on the other side that doesn't look like it's very happy to see him. Sort of think like silent comedies or something. It's going to chase him around the yard, right? It's a dangerous path he's on. And he's passed by on that path this inn because he's been a diligent pilgrim, right? But he's having second thoughts. Maybe I should go back. And we can see quite clearly that this inn is a negative place. This is not a good place to have stopped. It's an inn because it has the same kind of sign that Ostad's does, right? But it's a bad place because, one, there's a soldier in the doorway who's hung up his lance. Do I have to say that twice? Right? Hung up his lance. And he's groping this woman in the door, right? Broken windows, that repeats in the Van Ostade. A woman looks out the window, that repeats in the Van Ostade. Man pees against the wall, that repeats in the Van Ostade, right? So there's a bunch of stuff here that comes out of the tradition that he's now coloring in a potentially similar, potentially different way, right? And the importance of realizing that these things have traditions before we jump right in and say it can only mean one thing, right? We have to look at the legacy of these images because that's certainly something that would have meant something to Van Ostade, to Isaac. So Isaac studies under Adrian. Adrian studies under Molinar, right? Molinar studies under Hals. That's the legacy in Haarlem. The other artist that studies under Adrian van Ostade is Jan Steen, right? Our old friend Jan Steen. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see this in the Frans Hals Museum because I didn't know this picture. And it's so similar to what we're looking at here, the legacy that goes back to Bruegel, goes back to Bosch, deep into the 16th century. Again, rural activity. Right? A lot of Steen's pictures are about rural activity rather than deeply urban. Your picture was a bit different than that, right? Your portrait is different from that tradition. But for the most part, many of these are very much about rural traditions. And again, this is what we should trace it back to, right? This is another of these Bruegel images dancing in the peasant festival, right? And you can see, looking at this print, how many of the motifs, if you spend a long time looking, repeat, right? The circle dance here, we see that just starting under the arbor. We see the pigs in both of them, right? We see the inn with the people looking out the windows in both of them. I don't know if you can see her, but in the shadow on the far right of the stain is a woman urinating. And if you look at the church in the Bruegel, there's someone taking a dump next to the church there as well. Right? All these little things that he's picking up and he's reworking in this image. Again, these are the legacy for these rural scenes is Jan Steen. Or excuse me, is Peter Bruegel. The painting is a wreck. It's in really bad shape. And you can see the surface of the paint is revealing the canvas underneath it. It's been overcleaned through time. And the dress of the woman, for example, is absolutely this flat area of blue. Very little in the way of modulation for folds and whatnots because it's been so overcleaned through the centuries. But it's the beginning of the dance. This man has asked her out to dance. She seems to be pretty happy about that. Right? A nice couple, maybe another image of cooperation, right? Of unity, of diligence. But it's a infectious and happy scene, right? People are coming from all over. This is probably intended to be one of those village fairs, a kermesse, right? We see wagons in the background. Why bring wagons? You're bringing goods to sell, right? Something to set up and distribute things. But people are hearing the music and they're going to come join in on the dance, right? But we also have with these people some urbanites, tell by the hats, right, that have come out to the countryside to enjoy themselves. And it's a terribly enjoyable picture, right? We see smoking, happy dog laying down, drinking, everybody getting along just fine. They're eating machas, herring, pickled herring, which you can buy on the street now, but is normally a fair food, right? We do cotton candy. They do machas, right? And there's our woman wiping herself back there, right? So she's been... And that's the sign that not everything is good here. This isn't just something, this is, again, a morally fraught landscape. And there's this little boy, right, pointing to an older boy who's gotten soused, right, and is now fallen asleep with the pigs, right? Very much like the prodigal son who winds up with the swine. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's sinning, right? He's not meant to be the prodigal son, but he's meant to be associated with the prodigal son. And as we look more closely further, we find there's dad, right? And he has had so much that mom and daughter and son have got to help him get home. They've got his robe, they've got his hat, and he's too drunk to walk, right? So there's a message here, isn't there, that these country fairs present to us these problems, right? Now this picture is an exact analog to a much more refined picture, much better shape, down in the National Gallery. It's exactly the same theme, right? With different elements happening around the outside of it, right? Where again, a couple is starting to dance. See the musical accompaniment on the right now. But the difference is who's participating, right? Because they're very, very much an ill-matched couple. In the Frans Hals Museum picture, she looks like she's game. In this one, she's going to dance with him, but there's something about the body language that suggests restraint. That he thinks he's all of that. Apparently, the feather was not part of the original composition. He added that on as he was working, so it means something, right? The feather in his cap. And I think it means he thinks he's all that, right? And he's had enough to drink to ask this pretty girl out for a dance. And she's looking at us going like, well, we all know where this is going to go, right? And it's a great fun scene for exactly that. Now we're at 9:15, so we don't have time for this. So this is really my second to last Jan Steen that we're going to look at. So we'll look at this one more, and then I think next week we'll look at more genre pictures, sort of more sedate ones, Vermeer and whatnot, right, to give us that. And then I think our last week, because the week after that we're off, we'll look at landscape paintings. That'll fit in quite nicely. But rather than go to landscape and come back to genre, I think we'll go straight into sort of the high life genres rather than these low life genres that we've been looking at for today. Right? So, again, just a reminder that the paper's now a week from Friday rather than Friday, so you have an extra week to work on them. However, if you want to get them in early to me, that's fine as well. And then the due date for the revision of those will be May the 1st, right, which is a Wednesday. Okay? It can be after class, that's fine, right? But the 1st, and then at that point you'll sort of shift gears to be laying out your brochures for test week. Okay? And on May the 1st, we'll talk more about sort of what we're going to do during test week and whatnot, potluck or something like that. Okay? And I doubt we'll be here for the entire 2.5 hours. All right? Good. See you guys next week then.